The Police Oversight Commission, on which Richard Schein served, was the subject of a police oversight task force that submitted its recommendations earlier this year. The 11 members of the task force called on the city to establish a new police oversight agency with more independence, more authority, and its own source of funding and staff. NMIF correspondent Gwyneth Dolan sat down with two members of that task force, as well as the police union and the independent review officer who investigates all civilian complaints against the police.
Alan Wagman is an assistant public defender and a former children's court attorney for the State Children, Youth and Families Department. He was recently on a task force that looked at ways to improve police oversight. Peter Simonson, the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of New Mexico, was also on that task force. Robin Hammer is the city's independent review officer. And Sean Willoughby is the vice president of the Albuquerque Police Union. I want to thank you all very much for all being here at the same time. We really, really appreciate it. We're talking about police oversight, and on the first page of the Federal Department of Justice's 46-page report finding excessive use of force by the Albuquerque Police Department, the authors outlined three major reasons that contributed to that problem. Number one was internal, that the department failed to make strong rules and enforce them among its officers. Reason number two was they said the system of civilian oversight was broken and that its failures had contributed to these problems. So looking at that report, Robin, it is particularly critical of your office and your predecessor as well, saying that, quote, you've simply been too forgiving of the department's use of deadly force and that you deprived the department of critical opportunities to correct its course, which contributed to the overwhelming pattern of unconstitutional use of deadly force that we find. When you read that, how did you feel?
Well, the Department of Justice report looked at a time frame from 2009 until December 2012. I took my position in September of 2012, and so really was only in my position for a period of 4 months of the subject of that review. My predecessor retired from his position, and I knew that there were criticisms of my predecessor's work as the independent review officer.
And yet this report was critical specifically of you, and it outlined a couple incidents. Did that make you feel responsible for some of this problem, even though you were only there for a part of the time they looked at?
Well, it was critical of me as I'm the person who's in the job, and I take responsibility for the position of the job. It outlined one case that they disagreed of my findings of a review of an officer-involved shooting as to whether or not the officer followed the standard operating procedures in place. And in that case, in which an individual by the name of Mickey Owings died after being shot by the police, involved the officer shooting at a car that was being driven by Mr. Owings at a very busy Walmart parking lot on the west side.
And they said in that case that you interpreted the rules to favor the officer and not the rules that were intended to protect people in cars. So were they right? I mean, why did you make that decision?
Well, I didn't. It wasn't to favor the officer. I reviewed the facts as they were presented through the investigation and the rules that were in place. The entire Justice Department report speaks heavily against shooting at vehicles at any time. And in fact, one of the recommendations is that APD adopt a rule that they can never shoot at a vehicle for any reason. And I think that their criticism of my one review of that case, their one criticism of my individual work was of that one case which involves a vehicle, shooting at a vehicle, which they strongly disfavor.
Peter, one of the members of the Police Oversight Commission who resigned in protest recently, Richard Schein, told us this week that the structure of the Police Oversight Commission is seriously defective, in his words. And he said that the city attorney's office has made that situation worse by saying that the independent review officer doesn't report to this POC, but to the mayor's office. What did the task force look at and propose for the role of an independent review officer?
Well, I don't know that we actually substantively proposed changes to the role of the officer. Specifically, what we asked for is that we clarify something that was confused by the city attorney's office, which is that the IRO should actually respond to, should be supervised by the civilian oversight body. Let's keep in mind that this is a civilian oversight body, and so we want that civilian body to be monitoring, overseeing the entire investigative process. And so one of the recommendations that came out of the task force, one that I strongly favor, is to see the independent review officer being supervised by the POC, and I think, or the civilian body, whatever that new body may be. And I think that's critical for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that we'd like to see the civilian body not just look at individual citizen complaints, but also direct its attention to policy issues and patterns of problems and different programs that are operating inside APD, and making recommendations about how those programs can be changed. And it really can't do some of that work unless it has a staff that helps it gather the relevant data that can support those recommendations. So that was one of the stronger recommendations that came out of the task force's recommendations, that we have a unitary system with a civilian oversight body and staff to serve its functions.
That's more independent than it has been perceived to be so far.
And I would say that was a second very important point of the recommendations, again trying to summarize 18 different recommendations, but one of the important themes was that we have an entirely independent civilian oversight body, one that's not subject to influence from the mayor's office, one that's not subject to influence from the city council, one that has an independent source of funding that can't be threatened for political reasons of any sort. We want to restore trust in our APD, and we think that by having a fully independent civilian oversight body, that's one way to accomplish that.
Alan, if you have this independent body, who is going to choose? How could we select the members of this oversight body so that everyone is persuaded that they are responsible to the public and not handpicked by city councilors or the mayor or whoever?
Well, the task force, I mean, that was one of the things that the task force spent a lot of time talking about. And the task force recommendation actually came up with what I have to admit
just a lottery. We're just going to pull them out of a hat.
Was a convoluted procedure where there was a committee picked, and then the committee would then pick the members of the oversight body, and the primary purpose was to avoid exactly what you described, which was to avoid having a 9-member commission with each city council member picking a member, so that that member would be seen as responsible to that council member. And in fact, I've heard council members refer to commissioners as, my commissioner. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that a commissioner takes orders from a council member, but there's a perception that you're pleasing a particular council member. We were trying to avoid that, but it looks like in the ordinance, the last draft that I saw, they're going to a 9-member body with council members picking.
Sean, the report said that part of the blame here lies with the union's agreement with the city, saying that it undercut the power of civilian oversight, and that the agreement requires, for example, that complaints have to be signed by the person who is filing a complaint against an officer. Doesn't that intentionally intimidate people from filing complaints?
Absolutely not. I think it's very important, and it's part of this entire process. The vehicle to strong civilian oversight of the police department is the IRO. Who manages the IRO, who dictates who the IRO is going to be. The IRO, the independent review officer, is number one, educated in the rules of law. They know their job. They are a trained professional. They deal with investigators who know their job and are also trained professionals. By the union contract, they have carte blanche authority to not only do full investigations, including Garrity statements. They're at all police officer involved shootings. This is an extremely independent arm of civilian oversight.
And yet that's not what the DOJ report found. It found that the independent review officer rarely found evidence of misconduct or inappropriate use of force, in contrary to what the DOJ found, which was a consistent pattern of that kind of force. So maybe,
I would be willing to argue with the DOJ with what they found.
and we would expect you to.
Yes,
But don't you agree that there need to be some changes here?
definitely. What I agree with is not that change is necessarily needed. I think that if you used both of these entities the way that they are properly and supposed to be used, you would have an effective both POC and IRO. I do believe in more training. I do believe the POC needs a staff. I think they need to be properly funded as well as I do the IRO. But the IRO is your investigative body of civilian oversight. The POC can't be both. They are two separate entities. And when you get convoluted, by joining them together. The POC is ineffective and inefficient and doing what they're supposed to be doing within the current ordinance already.
One of the reasons that the DOJ criticized the POC was because it was very limited by the union agreement in the amount of information it could have about officers. They couldn't know the officer's name or his discipline history. Is that something that you will fight to keep in the rules?
Most definitely. You got to understand, when you're dealing with the POC and you're dealing with the IRO, you're dealing with an administrative personnel matter. These aren't criminal charges. This isn't a criminal investigation. This is a civil, this is a personnel matter.
But the fact
So-
that discipline was delivered is a public record.
I don't know
It
if
is.
that's correct.
It is.
Well, the fact that discipline was delivered and that it was delivered is public record, but what that discipline was, how long it was, as to why it was, Garrity protected statements, all of the facts of the case are somewhat protected. Therefore, when you take the investigation of the IRO and you put it into the public forum of the POC on government television, that's where you have your problem.
So what do you think the POC should look like?
What I think the POC should look like is a well-funded, well-oiled, well-trained machine of professionals who know their job, who can bring civilian oversight to another level. Civilian oversight should be doing investigative audits in internal affairs complaints and IRO complaints and study of structures within SOPs of police departments throughout the country. They should be identifying problems within the SOPs. What is going on here? Why are these officers getting in trouble for cameras all the time? Maybe the equipment is just not up to par. We should probably try to fix that as a civilian oversight body. That's what the POC should look like. The IRO should be completely independent, should not answer to the POC, the mayor, the city council. They should be an independent body, paid for professionals by the city of Albuquerque to investigate civilian complaints. If Robin Hammer calls strikes like strikes and balls like balls, she uses the facts of policies and procedures to determine what's going on. We argue
And so far,
all the time.
apparently, has used them in your favor.
Doesn't matter if the facts say that it should be in my favor. Shouldn't it be in my favor?
Well, those are in dispute, aren't they? So this is external oversight, but in terms of internal oversight, Alan, I want to ask you, the report said that the department's internal accountability systems did not work, and that force incidents weren't properly investigated, documented, or addressed with discipline. They said what they saw strongly suggested that supervisors went easy on officers on purpose. They described it as a pervasive and deliberate leniency. If that's true, what could resolve that internal problem and reassure the public that there is internal accountability?
What it would take primarily is a commitment from the mayor, the chief administrative officer, the chief of police, on down through the police chain of command to change that. External oversight won't change that. External oversight can possibly point out where there are problems, but it's going to take a real commitment in the executive, the way it's structured now, in the executive branch and the chain of command.
I think everyone is looking at the changes that are being proposed by the task force and the problems highlighted by the DOJ and thinking this is going to cost a lot of money. And we've been talking about the staffing issues at APD and how they have just not been able to get up to the 1,100 officer number that you've been trying to get to. But there's been something like $8 million of unspent money on those staffing issues. I mean, should we just say, hey, if you're not paying these people, let's spend it on these other reforms?
Well, I think you raise a very, very critical point, but at the end of the day, you have to understand that, other recommendations that the DOJ made within this report is talking about community policing. You can't community police when you're 350 officers down. You cannot. The natural attrition rate of the Albuquerque Police Department is 60 a year. So if you're not backfilling these officers in the academies, what you're going to do is you're going to find a department with 700, 600. You're going to have a department that's completely broken and doesn't have the time to even consider or think about your policy changes.
How much of that money should we spend on training that might help, resolve some of these issues, give you guys better tools?
You know what? I actually think the Albuquerque Police Department has a substantial good bar of tools. We have good.
Don't send us back to class.
No. I mean, we welcome any training that the city's going to give us. Any training that we can retain is going to help us. It's going to help the city. We have no complaints. You can train us all day long. We have good equipment. I don't think that police officers their cars aren't breaking down regularly.
You get the fancy new cars.
We've got nice new cars. We are a very well-equipped police department. I don't think that we suffer in that regime. But what you are suffering from is you have a huge morale gap in the Albuquerque Police Department. And one thing that nobody at the table has bothered to consider is that if you want these changes and you want them to succeed for the betterment of the police department and the community as a partnership, the rank and file needs to be on board.
Whose responsibility is that? I want to talk about the new chief, Gordon Eden. Mm-hmm. He came on this job at the worst possible time. I feel so bad for that guy taking that job at that moment. But he's had some stumbles. What do you think, all of you, but I'll start with you, Sean, how much time do you think he gets in order to prove that he is the one who's going to make change, do this leadership, change morale, and make it happen? How much time does he get?
Well, the breakdown of the Albuquerque Police Department didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be repaired overnight. To expect a new chief of any caliber or any experience or any education level to come in and flip a switch and change the Albuquerque Police Department, you're kidding yourself. Go ahead.
Is he too much of an insider, and is Huntsman too much of an insider? Should the city have looked farther and brought in someone from somewhere else?
Well, I'm troubled by the fact that before Chief Eden came in, he said he didn't think that there were problems in APD, and that training didn't need to be. He didn't think training needed to be changed before he even took the job. That obviously that conclusion that the Jonathan Boyd shooting was justified, from which he retreated after the mayor said he was troubled. I'm troubled by the choice of I think it was Captain Huntsman and now Deputy Chief Huntsman to be in the position of enforcing changes, given how critical the DOJ report was of SWAT operations and SWAT supervision, which is where Deputy Chief Huntsman was when he was with the department, and Deputy Chief Huntsman saying that he didn't see essentially saying he didn't see any problems anyway. He's waiting to see what the DOJ says the problems were. Even if everything was legitimate, the issue is it's not just the police have to be involved and behind it, but you've got to get the public behind it. And at minimum, the appearance is not of a mayor and a chain of command that's committed to really making changes with the statements that they've made coming in before they know and saying we think there's nothing.
Peter, is the leadership from the mayor to the deputy chief level, are they in denial?
Honestly, that's not a question I've considered very deeply. For me, what's important right now is for us to move forward. I agree with Robin. I think the DOJ is going to set benchmarks for the APD and for the city. And I think the community's responsibility, for our organization's responsibility, is to monitor and watch and see that the city makes reasonable progress towards achieving those benchmarks in every various area, whether it concerns the use of tasers, whether it concerns the use of lethal force, among other things. We intend to do that. We intend to be very, very involved in monitoring how compliance unfolds. You know, we are faced with a situation right now. This is a unique opportunity. If you look back 10, 11, 12 years ago, we were in this very same situation in Albuquerque. In 1997, 98, we had a string of officer-involved shootings. We had high court settlements, just like we've seen recently. The city, the APD and the community were at odds over the APD's performance. The result was the creation of the Police Oversight Commission. That was one of the main solutions that was proposed. We're now in a very similar situation. It's an identical situation. We're going to overhaul the Police Oversight Commission, but the difference is we've got an outside federal agency that has stepped in, done a thorough investigation of the department, and is going to make formal recommendations about how to improve that department, and maybe with a federal judge presiding over the city's performance in reaching those goals. This is our opportunity to reform the department. And as much as I understand the anger and the frustration with APD and the shootings that we've seen, we've got to be looking forward. And we've got to start making some progress towards legitimate reform. And I agree with Sean, actually, that everybody's got to buy into the process. And I think it's important that there are going to be criticisms, and there will be criticism from our organization about whether or not the city is making adequate progress. But at the end of the day, they need to be rational, and they need to be objective, and they need to really target ways in which the city can do better, and not set us back and not return us to problems that will distract from reasonable progress.
That's all the time we have for this, and I want to thank you all for being with us here. We have a little bit more conversation that we will have on the web.